welcome you guys to the second live event of our Just Green Transitions Challenge. This is our expert roundtable, and we're going to be hearing today from experts who are working on the Just Green transition in various sectors and areas, including finance and policy, and specifically on the area of a small island developing states. Just for a quick recap of our challenge so far. So we had our first expert webinar with Gleda Lon a few weeks back. And we've recently finished with the brainstorming portion of our challenge and have moved into the solutions phase as of Monday. So I'm really hoping this webinar is going to prompt a lot of different ideas or like help answer some questions that you might have about ideas that you've already been thinking about for the policy design phase. If you already do have some ideas, there is going to be what I'm hoping for a lengthy Q&A session at the end, so you can ask these experts any questions that you have. Today's session is going to be focusing on achieving the Just Green transition through different sectors and areas, so drawing on these different areas of expertise for the people that are here with us today. I'm going to introduce the panel shortly, but as for how the next hour will progress, we're going to hear brief introductions from all of our panelists, followed by a moderated discussion, and then I'm going to open the floor for Q&A. So be thinking about your questions or feel free to drop them in the chat as they come up, and I'll do my best to get as many answered as possible. We're going to end the webinar by 6, so we shouldn't be keeping you any longer. Just a bit of housekeeping. As you will have seen, this event is being recorded. You will have seen I put up the recordings of the expert webinar that we had a few weeks back on the platform. So that is for, if you can't stay the whole hour, or if you want to reference something that was said, or just rewatch the event, that will be up on the platform within a few days. So that's why we're recording this. Feel free to put your cameras on, make our guests feel welcome. If your connection is bad, we do ask that you turn it off and just type your questions and other comments in the chat. But yeah, all right. Thank you guys so much for attending. I'm going to go ahead and kick off with a brief introduction of all our panelists before turning the floor over to them. So I'm going to start with Champa Patel. She is the Executive Director for Governments and Policy at Climate Group, a role that includes leading on the strategy, development, and growth of the Under 2 Coalition. Most recently, she was the Director of Innovation and Deputy Director of the Future of Conflict program at the International Crisis Group, where she was responsible for research and advocacy on climate, tech, and the economic aspects of conflict. Before this, we did not overlap, but Champa was the Director of the Asia Pacific program here at Chatham House, where she was the manager basically for policy research on the region. And she also has experience working at Amnesty International, and generally sort of overseeing human rights research and advocacy. So welcome, Champa. Thank you for joining us. Next, we have Lida Prema, who's the founder and CEO of Sealand Air Capital, facilitating capital introduction for corporate climate projects, coupled with advisory on corporate investment readiness, global policy, and climate markets, and carbon markets, sorry. She is also the co-founder and managing partner of the Global Climate Finance Accelerator, which is a nonprofit that convenes partnerships across business, finance, government, and academia on strategies, policies, procedures, and tools to finance climate solutions. Her previous experience, a wealth of experience, includes transforming and aligning global policy for a major Canadian bank's capital markets, developing and implementing a global AML risk management and site visit program, and delivering on strategic initiatives, which included co-leading for capital markets the integration of a multi-billion-dollar U.S. bank acquisition. Since 2015, she has been a member of various B20 task forces, including anti-corruption, finance and infrastructure, and energy transition and climate, and the B20 Women in Business Action Council, providing policy recommendations to the G20 leaders. So welcome, Lida. Thank you for joining us. And finally, last but not least, we are joined by James Ellsmore, who is an award-winning entrepreneur and writer. As you'll see from his background, he is the co-founder and CEO of Island Innovation, and the co-founder and director of Solar Head of State. And he's been recognized on the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for his work on sustainable energy. He is very passionate about climate change advocacy and environmental policy, and he is particularly interested in promoting renewable energy infrastructure systems in rural communities, consulting for leaders and NGOs and the private sector and government on topics related to sustainable development and entrepreneurship. His work extends into climate change policy, renewable energy, and travel, and he has particular expertise in small island developing states, which he'll be telling us more about today. Interestingly, and I'm hoping he'll delve a little bit more into this, he has worked on the support team for the Republic of the Seychelles at various United Nations climate change conferences, which most of you will know as COPs. So welcome, James. Thank you to this wonderful, wonderful group of panelists for joining us this evening. So it's been increasingly obvious that the Just Green transition is absolutely imperative, particularly at the close of COP28, which is kind of the impetus for us, the CFC community, engaging in this topic specifically. As such, we are extremely lucky to be joined by these panelists for them to provide their expertise and insights on this topic. So I'm actually going to turn it now over to them to provide brief introductory remarks of about 5 minutes each, where they will discuss their work as it relates to the just green transition and set a bit of a stage for the moderated discussion and the Q&A session. So Lita, if I could turn to you first to provide some introductory remarks.
Great. Thank you so much, Whitney, and thank you for inviting me to join this panel. Let me tell you a little bit more about these two organizations that I'm involved in, because it's really a tale in two parts. So the Global Climate Finance Accelerator is currently partnered with the University of Toronto, where this past September, my co-founder oversaw a 4-credit Climate Finance Accelerator Graduate Studies independent study where students from the faculties of science, engineering, environment, the business school, and public policy came together to tackle different climate projects. Now, let me give you an example of what a climate project could be. So let's say there's a mining company that was looking to change its trolley assist infrastructure in one of its international mines. And while this might sound straightforward, or perhaps not entirely, when you bring all these faculties together, you end up with a very comprehensive overview because you can start to ask questions like, what kind of materials would be best suited for the project? How does each one impact the cost? How does each one impact the environment? Does the new system slow down the operating time and therefore the efficiency of the mine? What's the regulatory landscape in the country? Are there government incentives that can be leveraged? Are carbon credits created? Can these be used to offset the cost of the project? So you get the picture. But by bringing together all of these areas of expertise to work together right from the beginning, a company has the ability to make a truly informed decision. And on the flip side, during the semester, the students have a dedicated employee from the company to work with so that they can take real world versus assumed corporate considerations into account. So outside of the academic course, the accelerator is focused on research. And a new area that we're diving into is corruption in climate finance. And more on that in just a minute. But it also became clear that once these projects were researched and analyzed, the project owners might need help finding funding. So whether that's loans, financing, investment, and this is where Sea Land Air Capital was born. So to match the corporates and the financiers with the highest likelihood of success. So if we turn to the just green transition, it's vital to also take a comprehensive look at both the impacts and how to effectively move through the transition. Because when you look at things in silos, your solutions become very limited. And there's a few different points that I'd like to talk about on this subject. So first, I really want us to take the word literally and remember that this is a transition. Currently, there's a very strong narrative that fossil fuels need to end today. And while that would be great for the planet to be able to just turn off the switch, this just isn't realistic. And by their very nature, and whether we like it or not, transitions take time. But let me be clear, I'm not saying we need to be slow, because obviously we're in a climate emergency. So we have to act with a sense of urgency. But we have to be realistic in our expectations and especially in the narrative around it, because we need to get everybody's buy-in. The transition is about workers. And I'm not talking about the CEOs of the big polluters, but the average everyday worker. And they didn't create the industries like oil and gas, but this is how they feed their families. And if we ever hope to make the substantial changes that are necessary, we need to get their buy-in. And you can't just tell them that the new green economy is going to be better. You have to train them with the skills that they need to be successful in the new economy, because that way they can see a place for themselves there, and they'll know that they can continue to feed their families. So another topic I want to come back to is corruption. So as most people know, that in the first 4 days of COP28 alone, 57 billion US dollars was mobilized for climate action. So that's a lot of money that's going to be flowing around the world. And therefore, there's an unprecedented and urgent need to tackle corruption if we're going to achieve the just green transition. And here again, many people think that corruption is synonymous only with bribery, so the cash changing hands. But it's also about influence, and that takes many different forms. So things like granting permits and licenses and infrastructure contracts to friends of people in political office, Public procurement, for example, doesn't matter what country you live in, this is a space that's rampant with corruption. But this is also an opportunity for us to tackle it where it starts. So, how do you do that? You do that by having public beneficial ownership registries, or at least have them in the works if they're not already there. But make those public procurement processes accessible and searchable online, and make sure that the beneficial owners of those companies are named, and provide the rationale behind the selection. So this is where transparency and accountability is vital and key, because if corruption goes unchecked, the capital's not going to reach the people who need it the most. And in both climate change and corruption, those are the most vulnerable. And disproportionately, those are also women and girls. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Sita. That was really, really great and some great thoughts to open on. I'm sure that's already sparked some questions from our audience. James, if I could turn to you next for some introductory remarks.
Great. Thanks so much, Whitney. So I wanted to just give a bit of an overview of the work that we do and specifically why we're interested in islands, and what that means, what to be covering islands in terms of climate change. But I'd love to hear from those of you in the audience, maybe where you're all joining from. So if people don't mind just taking a moment to type in the chat which part of the world, country, city you're in, I think that'd be really nice for me and the speakers to get an idea of who's here with us to address those thoughts. So I can see Nora's in Egypt, Nada in Egypt, Nigeria, Burundi, Canada, Toronto, London, Ghana, Switzerland. Okay, so really across Europe and Africa. That's awesome. Zimbabwe, India, Cornwall, a whole range. Great. We'll keep putting those in if you haven't already, because that's interesting. I haven't seen any islands yet. I'm not counting the UK as a whole. So, but I'd be curious if there is anyone. But our organization, Island Innovation, looks at the needs of island communities around the world. And this is a whole range of places. So from the far north of Canada or the Scottish Islands to the African islands of Sao Tome, Principe, Seychelles, to the South Pacific, these communities around the world are on the front lines of climate change. All island communities, by their very nature of geography, are looking at really the impacts of climate change accelerated far beyond what everyone else sees. And many of you have probably heard of Tuvalu in the South Pacific, which has become a poster child for one of the most vulnerable countries in the world, because the whole country is 1 meter above sea level at most. And the population of 12,000 in the whole country might see their country disappear from under their feet. But actually, those issues of climate change, as critical as they are in Tuvalu, are also challenges for many different island and coastal communities around the world. What we do at Island Innovation, we really have this network and community to connect all these different islands around the world and say, although they may have very different cultural contexts, climates, local challenges, actually many of the difficulties that they're looking at are the same. So of course, challenges around climate adaptation is one of them, challenges in financing climate adaptation, but other things, the high cost of electricity, challenges in disposing of waste, looking at the high impact of tourism, and sometimes this very challenging aspect of, on the one hand, being on the forefront of climate challenges, but also being entirely dependent on air travel for their economy, their tourism, and their own citizens to travel. And so what we found was that many of these different places around the world were trying to solve the same problems on their own. There weren't necessarily the channels to be able to connect them. How does a local county in Scotland interact with a region or a state like Hawaii or Prince Edward Island in Canada, or a small island developing state like Barbados or Fiji? And I know Whitney particularly wanted me to focus on the small island developing states. So within the UN system, there's around 40 countries that are classified as small island developing states. They make up around 2% of the global population, but a significant chunk of UN member states. As I mentioned, some like Tuvalu are just 12,000 people. And so when it comes to the COPs and the climate conferences, these countries are actually some of the loudest voices and most active participants in calling out the big polluters and highlighting the challenges that they have. But they're also places that really need to find ways of financing the challenges that they're approaching. And so my background is more on the renewable energy side, and also climate adaptation. And I'd be happy to talk about, when we think of a just transition, how some of these communities that are marginalized by geography are impacted, that maybe are considered by the periphery, whether it's within a country or on the global stage, and how we might want to think about that when it comes to a just transition. Thanks, Whitney.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And yeah, I definitely would love to return to sort of the conversation surrounding geography. But first, it'd be fantastic if we could hear from you, Champa, a few introductory remarks.
Hi, everyone. It's great to meet you all virtually. Very similar to James, so I won't speak for too long. We work in a very similar way to how he works with islands, but we work with states and regions. And that's the level of subnational government, that's the level below a nation state. The Under 2 coalition that Whitney mentioned is a coalition of almost 200 state and regional governments. And this is everybody from Wales to Maharashtra, to Western Cape in South Africa, to Mato Grosso in Brazil, to Cross River State in Nigeria. So it really is states and regions of all different sizes, capacities, capabilities, who are coming together because they have a commitment to accelerating and taking ambitious climate action. And very similar to islands, they're often on the front line of responding to climate emergencies, and they're often the first responders. So in that respect, you know, there's a strong argument to be made for localization of how do we ensure that those who are best equipped to know what local needs are resourced and supported to be able to meet those challenges. So for example, if you look at some of the governments that we work with, often they're not around the table. So if you look at the COP process, which we mentioned earlier, the UNFCCC COP process, the Paris Agreement, that's an agreement between nation states agreeing what action they're going to take towards keeping global temperatures below 1.5 degree temperature rise. But a lot of that implementation actually happens at the subnational level, and yet these actors are not part of the conversation. A lot of the international climate finance that exists is directly directed at nation states and not really channeled through to subnational governments who do a lot of that implementation. And the reason that they're important is that they often have a lot of powers. They have fiscal powers. They can, you know, many governments, if they have devolved powers, are able to raise their own taxes, bonds, take part in carbon markets. They have regulatory power, legislative power. So I think they have a range of tools available to them to be able to ensure that local needs are both identified and responded to ensure a just transition. And some of the work that we've done with the coalition is to map out exactly what those just transition case studies look like. So for example, we recently worked with Cross River State in Nigeria, where there was a whole project around understanding the specific needs of women who were most impacted by climate change. So because of issues in terms of protecting the Bumaji forests, where, you know, forest mismanagement and land use degradation has really impacted women's livelihoods and security and food security, there was a need to think through the policy options that were needed in order to make sure that there was a transition that meant that the women were still able to do the food gathering, the food preparation, have job security, be able to maintain livelihoods. So in order to respond to these concerns, one of the tools that the government used was a participatory planning process with women, and really centered them in the discussions to ensure buy-in before the policy development happens. So I think what we do is try and support states and regions to use tools like this to really think through how do you bring local communities, different groups that are either marginalized or affected by climate change to be really part of the conversation. So some of the other areas we've looked at, for example, around financing for just transition, and how do you navigate workforce transitions? Because as already has been mentioned, jobs are closing, but the new jobs haven't been created. And how do you upskill and reskill people for the jobs of the future that will come, but not quite here yet? So I think these are some of the ways in which we try and support our governments to think through how to address the just transition. I think what would be useful for us to, it'd be great to hear from those who are on the call and hear more about your experience or what you know, what's happening in your localities, of how much of that is happening at the local level. Because I think, what I'm really struck by in working with states and regions is the level of disempowerment for the actors who are most at the front of having to deal with some of the challenges that we see, when it's so hard to access finance, when it's so hard to put in place what's needed to tackle the issues that they're dealing with. How do we start making sure that these actors, whether they're states and regions, whether they're cities, whether they're islands, can be centered more in the discussions, because they are the implementers. And I'm really struck that often they're at the margins of the discussion. So it'd be great to think about that a little bit more as well.
Thank you so much, Champa. And I see a lot of names on here who I know are working on in the climate space. And so I'm sure we'll have some input as to sort of how they're seeing that in their local communities. Because I think probably across the board, the finance aspect is an issue. Champa, I'm really, really interested in your work with the Under 2 Coalition. That's so fascinating. I think you're so right that, all of these sort of high level agreements are between nation states, but when it really comes down to it, it's like anything from individuals to smaller or lower levels of government that are not nation states are actually going to be the ones implementing it. What do you think in an ideal situation are the roles that these different levels of government can actually play in achieving the just green transition?
So I think it's complicated, because what you would have in an ideal world is a level of multi-level action where national governments make commitments, they ensure that resourcing flows through to subnational governments, and then the implementation occurs at the local level. But the reality is we have a multilateral system that doesn't quite work. And not just on climate, on conflict resolution. You see this now with some of the debates that are taking place at the Security Council. It's a dysfunctional multilateral system that's very slow in moving when you have a climate emergency that requires urgent action now. So in that respect, what you do find with cities, states, and regions is that they have been moving faster, and often much quicker than the nation states. So if you look at the US under Trump, California was still progressing with its climate action, despite what the national context was, right? So you have, on the one hand, the federal government withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, but then the states coming together to say, no, we're still going to follow these commitments and we're still going to meet them. So I think the reality is, who is at the vanguard of climate action now? It really is subnational actors. They're the ones really doing this work, but they're the least financed and least capacitated to do so. So I think multi-level action is critical. So what we try to do is connect city, state and region and national conversations together, but not in a way that the states and regions or cities are reliant on national governments, because often they have a lot of powers which they may not be using that they can use to advance goals by themselves. And sometimes it's just thinking through, well, you have these fiscal tools, you can raise your own revenue, you're not going to be able to meet the funding gap of what's needed. So how do you then have policy incentives that can unlock investment from the corporate sector? So I think it's, thinking through what can be done at the subnational level that's much more bottom up than top down.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that. And I think the California example is actually a great one.
Well, California is, Lydia, you would know more than me, but it's the 8th largest economy in the world if you look at, I think, either PPP or GDP. So it's crazy to think a state has that kind of economic power, right?
Right.
But the vast majority of states are not like that. But they still have tools at their disposal that they could use to think more creatively about how to unlock financing. Because the issue with the just transition is, without financing, it's really difficult to do, because a just transition is about socioeconomic development goals, right?
Definitely.
And that requires financing and resourcing to meet that those ambitions.
Right. Do you have any members of the Under 2 Coalition that are like based islands or based on islands?
We do. Hawaii is
another
common
another
to
state.
James and us. Yeah. No, we have quite a few. We work a lot with Indonesian. It's archipelago, so we have a lot of Indonesian members. So we do have islands as well.
Very cool. So that, I think that sort of highlights the increasingly recognized reality that I know Island Innovation is working hard towards getting more out there. And like you said, James, the voices are quite loud at COP, because also the realities of climate change are hitting a lot of island states a lot quicker than they are for people who are maybe based not on islands. Can you speak a little bit about what the specific challenges that small island states might face in achieving the green transition that might be different from sort of developing nations more broadly?
Absolutely. And yeah, I really enjoyed everything that Champa said, because I think, as I mentioned, we work with the states, which are obviously fully participating members of the UN, etc. But then many of the islands that we work with are themselves the subnational regions, so Hawaii, the Azores, etc. And of course, there are differences in all of those. I know that a lot of the work that you do, Champa, is more on the mitigation side. Many of the island communities, the populations and their contributions to climate change are minuscule. So the question is often more about adaptation than mitigation. But of course, those two things often go hand in hand, and many of the islands themselves are pioneering on the form of renewable energy and the renewable energy transition. But when it comes to the UN system and the islands, I think one of the interesting challenges has been obviously and one of the big calls at the COPs is this need for finance. So again, financing adaptation. One of the interesting challenges that many of the small island developing states have is that they're considered middle or upper income countries. And so at a certain level, you graduate out of being able to receive foreign aid. But that is based on GDP per capita, which we all know is a kind of arbitrary amount in a way. You know, imagine if you're a very poor island, but you with a small population, but you have this great big hotel that is all shiny and generates a lot of income. That pushes up your GDP per capita. It doesn't necessarily reflect the average living conditions of the people living there. Equally, you have many countries. So a good example of this would be Dominica in the Caribbean, not the Dominican Republic, Dominica, which has a population, I think, around 100, 150,000. And a few years ago, the island was absolutely devastated by Hurricane Irma. That wiped out the equivalent of 250% of annual GDP in one night. So although they were considered a middle income country, does that GDP per capita measurement really recognize the vulnerability that's faced when you are such a small jurisdiction? So AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States that represents these countries in the UNFCCC process, one of the things that they've been doing has been calling for a multi-dimensional vulnerability index. So essentially ways of measuring vulnerability that go beyond GDP per capita to look at the various aspects that to give a more holistic measurement. There's been various different indexes that have been proposed that would suit islands, and all of them have their pros and cons. There's no ideal way of measuring those. But I think just that point that obviously GDP itself is an imperfect measurement, and considering others when it comes to financing, because all of these small island developing states absolutely need climate finance investment for adaptation.
That statistic is shocking, and I'm sure it's not an isolated case, unfortunately. James, I do want to come back to the regional discussion, sort of about how, like, you know, the challenges of different island nations based on their geography, but you did provide us a great segue to move to Lita. You have an extensive background in finance and investment, which, as James has just said, is a massive problem and facet of the Just Green Transition discussion. When and how did you start to sort of bridge the gap between these areas and climate, and what do you believe is the importance of doing so?
Well, thanks. It's a really great question. Sustainable finance for me has long been a passion. I even wrote about it in my dissertation for my MBA. And what I noticed was that there was a mismatch between those who needed the money and those who provided the money. And the mismatch went a little bit further, where those who needed the money didn't even know where to start to find it. So, as I mentioned earlier, the mission for Sealand Air Capital is to match the corporates with the financiers. But the most important part of that is it's to match them where the highest likelihood of success is going to be. So let me give a practical example of what I mean by that. So I'm assuming everybody, and hopefully this is a true statement, is saving for retirement, even if it's $20 here and there. Okay. So you put together your investment dollars and you have to decide where you're going to put them. So is this going to be in stocks, in bonds, in crypto? And then what sector are you going to invest in? Is it clean energy? Is it your favorite retailer or brand? And let's just say, so now we're going to get a little crazy. What if flying cars were where you thought the future was going to be? And so what you're going to invest in is anything and everything to do with flying cars. Now, let's say I then come to you and say, listen, here's a great stock with a company that makes running shoes that are made out of recycled plastic. Are you going to invest in that stock? Of course not, because that is not what your objective is. That's not part of flying cars. And so financiers are no different. They too have strategies with respect to which industries and sectors they want to invest in. But if you're a company that doesn't know who's interested in your particular sector, then you're going to spend an awful lot of time knocking on doors and just having them slammed in your face. And it'll have nothing to do with how good your company is, how good your idea is. And that's part of the big mismatch. And it's important because if we don't solve for that, the who has the money, where they want to invest it, then it's just going to be, it's going to take us a lot longer to get there. The other problem here is that, you know, you're looking at financing that's global. So you've got capital flows that are across the world. And here is where education comes in, because at times it's bigger investments that are needed versus the smaller. And then at other times you bring in all kinds of other risk. And in the private markets, risk and risk mitigation is number one. Well, okay, maybe it's 1B. 1A, and I'm just going to be frank about it, is how do I make money off of this? That is the bottom line. And so what companies need to do, and I'm not making a judgment on whether it's right or wrong, but that's the angle they have to go to the financiers with. It's who's going to invest in us? Like, where's the likelihood of success for us to get that money? And what are they looking for? And how best do I provide that information to them for them to make a decision?
That's really interesting, and honestly a good lesson sort of for anyone who's ever seeking grants or anything in general, is to, you know, make sure you're looking actually in the right places. It'll save you a lot of
Yeah.
time. One more question for you, Lita. The Global Climate Finance Accelerator, as you mentioned in your introductory remarks, is currently based in Toronto. As that's, you know, we've got such a widespread global community, I'm curious to hear if you have any plans for partnerships in other geographic locations, any plans for expansion. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. We are very interested in taking the model that we have here in Toronto, and we literally can transplant it to any location and any geography. What we would like to do, because there's so many great universities to partner with, the real concept is getting all of those faculties together to make or to come up with comprehensive research and analysis and recommendations. Where we'd like to get to, and hopefully it'll be in the near future, is we would also like to provide real jobs for some of the graduate students who come out of the course to be able to land and have a couple of years of real world experience, because climate projects don't just happen during semesters, right? It's not just September to December or February to June. So what we would like to be able to do is partner and take this around the world. And what's going to be really vital and important is partnering with the governments and also with business, along with the academics. You know, we have to have everybody together at the table.
Thank you so much for that. That's, yeah, and I know we have a lot of university students, so, you know, if this is sounds interesting to anyone, I'm sure Lita would be happy to be in touch. I also am aware that I don't want to take away from sort of broader Q&A time, but if I could get James and Champa to maybe touch on one more thing each, and then I will open the floor up to Q&A, semi-related, more sort of about regional dynamics. But James, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about sort of the challenges that small island nations might face across regions, so maybe in the Caribbean versus small island nations in Africa, if that's a theme that you know, maybe that's not as much of a theme, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. And then Champa, if I could potentially get you to bring in a bit of your sort of climate expertise, and pair that up with, the conflict expertise, and pair that up with our discussion on climate. Just given a lot of the protracted conflicts, many of our CFC members are coming from countries that have experienced protracted conflict, and I know that that is having a massive impact on the discussions around climate change. So that would be great if you could talk a bit about that. James, you're welcome to kick us off.
Sure. So when we talk about the SIDS countries, the small island sorry, Champa, can you go? Someone just knocked.
Oh, sure. Do you want me to go?
Yeah, it was good that I asked two at once then. Yeah, go for it.
So the relationship between climate change and conflict, and I know there's a lot of attention on this at the moment, is quite complex and context specific. I think it's more accurate to think of climate change as a threat multiplier that increases food insecurity, water scarcity, resource competition, and disrupts livelihoods and spares migration, etc. But it's much harder to draw a direct correlation or link between the climate change impact and then deadly conflict itself. So I think in that sense, what you see is it often aggravates, exacerbates pre-existing tensions, stresses, vulnerabilities in a country that then just makes the situation worse. And as you noted, if you look at the list of countries that are most vulnerable to climate volatility, the vast majority of them are also facing either protracted or more recent armed conflicts. So, for example, if you just take the Horn of Africa, it's had an unprecedented drought. Libya and South Sudan have had devastating floods. Somalia's had both, as has Afghanistan. So what you often see is, these are high-risk countries for part of the challenge where you have a climate nexus with conflict is that these are the countries that are going to be the least likely to receive financing for mitigation or adaptation. And that's because of the real and perceived risks of poor governance, capacity to carry out projects, de-risking investments, the general instability that really deters investors. Yet they are the countries that are most, needing these interventions. So I think when we talk about states and regions in general, or cities or islands, and how they're often not part of the conversation, can you imagine if it's a country that's facing conflict? They're even more on the margins of some of these discussions. But this is not a future problem, this is a now problem. They're already experiencing these challenges now. So I think that's a real kind of blind spot in terms of how we meet the needs of these countries and what's needed from a wide range of stakeholders, not just governments, but multilateral institutions, the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, private sector, in order to try and think through what can be done in some of these contexts, which is challenging where there's no peace, right? So I think, to see climate change as a threat multiplier rather than as a leading directly to conflict.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it seems like a self-fulfilling prophecy then, if there's such a need for funding, but there's also the perception from funders that it's quite unstable. Speaks a bit potentially, or at least perception of corruption, probably, that you were discussing earlier.
It's a little bit to what Lida says. How do you de-risk investment to a degree that people are comfortable? And actually the return on profit, which is going to be a big driver, is just not there.
Right.
So, what do those financing structures look like? Because the conditions are not there for, quote unquote, typical investment returns.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. James, I see you're back. Do you want to touch a bit on the geographies question?
Sorry, it always happens when you go.
No worries. We've all been there.
Someone's banging on the door. So what I was going to say is the small island developing states, obviously, there are certain commonalities between them. That's why they're a grouping, and this grouping is useful, but actually they're very diverse. I mean, even the acronym I always think is interesting. Are they small? Well, some of those islands have over 10 million people living there. Some of them have 10,000. Are they islands? That might seem surprising, but 3 of the small island developing states listed by the UN are actually not islands, but are low-lying countries that share characteristics: Guyana, Suriname, and Guinea-Bissau, all of which have islands and have certain connections, but for various reasons historically fallen into that. Are they developing? Well, technically Singapore is still classed as a small island developing state, or the Cayman Islands, which may not really be considered. And then are they states? Well, as we discussed, some of the subnational elements do consider themselves states. So the British Overseas Territories, for example, like the Cayman Islands. So on the one hand, it's a useful grouping. On the other hand, there's a lot of diversity and challenges within that. Within AOSIS, there are three regions that are represented. So one is the Caribbean and one is the Pacific. Those two have very strong regional organizations that really play a very important role to share resources. When you're a small country, of course, you're not going to have all the resources available to you to a large country. And so pooling resources makes a lot of sense. The third group is called AIMS, Africa, Indian Ocean, Mediterranean, South China Sea. That's actually a bit of an outdated acronym because Malta, which was the Mediterranean one, is no longer classed as a SIDS since it joined the European Union. But it does include all of the African SIDS, so the Seychelles, Mauritius, Cape Verde, etc. The challenge, I think, is quite unique for the African and Indian Ocean SIDS because they don't have the same regional infrastructure to support them that the Caribbean and the Pacific have. Obviously, they have the African Union, they have these other kind of international, but you can imagine the very small countries get a bit lost within the greater structure of the African Union compared to large countries like Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Africa. So I think that was the question, right? How are the different groups organized? And I saw a comment in the Q&A as well, asking about the multi-dimensional vulnerability index. I'll put a link in there. I won't go too much into the detail now, but just to say that the idea is basically beyond GDP to look at other elements, including economic factors, social factors, and which sometimes are harder to measure, and especially getting data across these very small countries can be a real big challenge. But once that data is collected, factoring that in to make an index to show the level of vulnerability. I'll add a link into that. I think it was Kamal who asked that question.
That's great. Thank you so much. You're already doing a better job of moderating the chat than I am. Okay, thank you all so much. I do want to open the floor for questions. I see we have one more in the Q&A, so I'll go ahead and get that one addressed. But if the rest of you have any questions, go ahead and put your hands up. I see yours, Noor. And then we will just sort of carry on with questions answered. If these aren't addressed to kind of specific panelists, I'll just put it out there, and whoever kind of feels equipped to respond, or if multiple people want to respond, that's also fine. But our first one is from Faith. So she wants to know about building sustainability and community resilience when it comes to external climate finance and intervention.
Sorry, can we expand on what she's asking about?
Yeah, Faith, if you can drop a sort of a bit of an expansion in the chat or put on your microphone if you are still there. But yeah, a little expansion might be helpful in answering that. Noor, I saw your hand up next. So I'm going to go ahead and come to you, and then we'll come back to you, Faith.
Thank you so much, Whitney, and thank you all to all the panelists for the amazing insights. I'm Noor Mohammed. I wear many hats, but this hat is the CFC one, as well as the rolling member, because I heard talking about corruption and environment as well as women, which is something that I'm working on, and it was like music to my ear when I heard Lida speaking about it. So I have actually a lot of questions, but I'll try to make them fast and brief. Firstly, for Lida, I wanted to ask, in case of countries where corruption, I would say, is endemic, and it's not something that you can handle from a governmental level, because the government in itself is corrupt, which impedes the fact that we get climate finance, but at the same time, we need the climate finance. So do you have any perhaps like advice, like how do you deal with these kind of contexts where countries in the global south are dealing with corruption, yet they need the climate finance to work on adaptation and mitigation? So that's the first question. And then the second question is actually for James, because for instance, in Egypt, in a lot of the countries in the MENA region, one of the greatest issues with just transition is the fact that there are stereotypes about gender roles, where women, for instance, in renewable energy are not really perceived as, as a job that women could work in, which is hindering the just transition a lot. And I'm really curious whether you have also the same case in the SIDS context, and whether you've maybe have done any interventions in that context. And the final question for Champa, I really am curious, the nature of the coalition. Do you reach out to governments, or like how can a government or a country join the coalition? And is it represented by a governmental official, or is it represented by young people? And one tiny question is, because I heard you speaking about case studies for green transition, so on and so forth, are you also working perhaps on developing some standards? What is green? Because I believe there are a lot of talk about green, and which leaves a lot of room for greenwashing and hinders also the just transition. I'm sorry for the super many questions, but yeah.
No, that's great. Maybe we can answer, you guys can answer in the order she asked. I think Lita, maybe you were first.
I was, yes. Okay, so Nora, like, great questions. You raise a very good point, because in some of these countries in the global south, corruption is endemic, and you don't want to paint all of them with the same brush, but the problem does persist and it's very real. And so while I don't have a definitive ABC, this is what needs to be done, I think, if we have to look at some of the unconventional ways to answer this, and this is where civil society will play a bigger role, and different organizations where maybe they come in to project manage and control the funding. And a lot of times that's not going to fly with some of the governments that are in power, but we know that if it goes directly to those governments, we're not going to see the funding go to where it's most needed and to the most vulnerable. And so the hard part is tying any sort of funding to something, tying it to anything is difficult. And so when it comes to corruption, maybe this is where the transparency and the accountability has to come in, where here are the exact dollars, it has to be all accounted for, transparency behind the beneficial owners of the companies that are engaged to actually deliver on the projects that are being funded. That's going to be important. But also taking a look at the ties between, as I mentioned before, is the influence, right? Looking at the ties between who gets awarded those contracts, because then you're looking at things like quality. And if you have a company that's a friend of whoever minister, and they get the contract because either they slid some money or maybe that that minister put some money into his own pocket, then we get into a whole other aspect of, and I think Champa, you were talking about this, right? Where it's the actual safety of people that is impacted because the quality of the materials may not be there. So I know I said a lot, but maybe didn't say anything too substantive. But I think civil society really is has a key role to play, and third-party project management might be something to introduce.
Great, thank you. I believe, I don't remember if James or Champa were next, but feel free to address that question from Noor.
I think he's deferring to me again. No, it's a really interesting question, because in order to join the coalition, they have to sign up to a set of commitments. And to Leader's point, they then have to be transparent and report against those commitments. So it's really interesting. A couple of years, all of the Moroccan states joined the coalition, which was a surprise to us. We're currently speaking to the, I think, 47 governors in Kenya all join in as a bloc, 2-under-2 coalition. So in a way, we're not doing the hard work of convincing them, because the price of entry is that you have to commit to doing these things, and you have to be transparent about the progress you're making, and you will be expected to report back against it. So when you have those states and regions coming in, that's what I'm saying. Some of these states and regions really are the vanguard of driving climate action, because they're on the forefront, foot forward in terms of trying to make this happen. So it is a government coalition. It's not open to civil society or young people. But what we do is support governments to make those relationships, because I agree with you, Leader. What we've often seen is in territories where it's more challenging to work, and this was more the case when I did conflict work, we have worked a lot more with civil society as a trusted interlocutor. So I think it's thinking through, in any ecosystem, who are the range of actors present, and who are the ones that you can work with in order to advance the goals that you have. And sometimes you get surprising constellations that come together. So I think that's quite interesting to think through what's possible with all the range of actors that are at play in any kind of geography.
Thanks, Champa. James, yeah, go ahead.
So Nora, I don't think I'm going to do your question justice because I'm not a gender expert. And I was thinking, what are the differences specific to the small island developing states that would make them different than any other country when it came to gender? And on the one hand, of course, all of the same challenges that exist to women around the world exist in those countries, right? One of the interesting observations, just going to the back to the last question, is there are definitely regional differences. And again, that comes back to the heterogeneity of that group, that each country is going to have its own challenges. So women in Comoros are going to have different challenges than women in Fiji or Jamaica. And I do see differences between the Caribbean and the Pacific. I mean, we do a lot of work in the Pacific, and unfortunately, in politics and political decision making, there is a very low participation of women. In most countries, less than 10% of elected officials are women. And there's only one in both the Caribbean and the Pacific, actually. There's only one female leader in each of those regions right now. I will say the female leader in the Caribbean is by far and away Mia Mottley, some of you may have heard of, from the Prime Minister of Barbados, is far and away one of the most impressive politicians on the global stage. Really someone that I really admire and look up to. So if you haven't heard much about Mia Mottley in Barbados, I would definitely look into her. She's also an interesting example where she's taken on the fight for the small island developing states countries, but has also taken on a broader initiative of really as a leader for the whole global South. And she's tried to, I think, as a way of knowing that SIDS issues often are seen as quite niche, by actually taking on the challenges specific to SIDS and those of the whole global South, she's actually been able to build a much larger platform and do some great work. And one of the last things I would say on that question is there are some interesting examples of islands that historically have been completely led by women, in the sense that there are many places where the men for 9-10 months of the year would be away at sea. And so they're quite specific, but I do think they're interesting examples of the impact that had on certain societies, where often men were left to migrate or to work on ships. And so the actual whole society was women-led in historic. I'm talking back 100 years or so. So I don't think I did full justice to your question there, but just a few thoughts that came up.
Just on that, James, you mentioned Mia Mottley, and her initiative, the Bridgetown Initiative, links to Scarlett's question in the chat. So maybe if we touch on that. The Bridgetown Initiative, I'm sure many of you are aware of, is about reform of multilateral development banks to increase the sort of financing that's available to countries in the global South and remove some of the conditionalities that at the moment make it very difficult. If you have a high debt, debt program that you have to service, it takes money away from then adaptation, mitigation, and resilience related investments, right? And Scarlett, to your question, I think you need both. Even if the MDBs, which we shouldn't forget, they provide financing to national governments, not necessarily subnational governments or islands or cities. So in that respect, the financial flow doesn't hit the local governments who are going to do the vast majority of the implementation. But that financing should be made more accessible, but by itself, it would never meet the funding gap. I think what you also need is bottom-up financing. So governments who have fiscal powers at their disposal to work creatively with the private sector, the financial sector, and think through how do you raise revenue that way as well. Because the amount of money that's needed is not going to be cracked by any one solution. So I think it's thinking through all the different ways in which we can creatively raise more revenue in order to do this work is needed. I don't know, Lida, what your thoughts are on that.
No, I completely agree. I mean, part of the problem, the gap that really needs to be filled right now is coming down to the local level. And why do I say this? Because, government finances are stretched very thin. You've got philanthropic dollars that are limited and impact investment dollars that are limited. You've got institutional money, which like pension funds, they look at very large scale projects, and you've got the private markets. Now they've got the capital, but the perception is that any investing in climate solutions are about philanthropy and losing money. or at least not getting the same return as you would in the traditional capital markets. Now, I mean, we know this is false narrative. And just because a green company doesn't make it doesn't mean it's because it's a green company, but that is the narrative. And so when you've got some of these bigger ideal investors, the sophisticated investors who understand the long time horizons for returns on investment, when they're only looking at the bigger projects, the big problem here is that the lifeblood of any economy is actually the small and medium-sized enterprises, and they're too small for these bigger investments. So there's mechanisms where you can pool some of these investments, but there's a huge small to middle market here that is completely underserved, and where we need to start funding the private capital. But that also needs to be in partnership with the domestic, like the local banks too. So it's very much the solution is local, but on the global problem. So I agree with you, Champa, 100%.
This is great. This is all so interesting. I think we could probably be here for a lot longer. But in the interest of time, I'm going to try to take definitely one, hopefully two more questions. Maybe if we could just get sort of slightly briefer answers, that would be great. If your question does not get answered, I will connect with you and make sure that it does. I'm sure Champa, Lida, and James will be happy to sort of answer some questions after the fact, because this has been a really, really interesting discussion. Faith had her hand up briefly, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move to Nada.
Hi everyone. Sorry, because I'm Noor's sister, that's why there's an echo. But whatever. Like, thank you so much for this very insightful discussion. It's very interesting. I have a couple of questions. I'll try to keep them brief as well. So I wanted to ask James a little bit more about the multi-dimensional vulnerability index and whether you see it as fitting with the different calls when it comes to the well-being economy that is being promoted right now. And I know that's a difficult answer to provide, but how do you anticipate this shift? How fast could it happen given the current trends? And building up on that question, I wanted to ask if you see the multi-dimensional vulnerability index as some sort of a standard for us to be able to decide as to which countries deserve the loss and damage finance that is currently being mobilized. That's one thing. Another question, it's not really directed to anyone, but it's up for anyone to answer. So at COPs, we see a lot of coalitions happening, a lot of pledges happening, and most recently at COP28, there was the Coalition for High Ambition Multi-Level Partnerships. So to try basically to amplify the role of cities in the realization of countries' nationally determined contributions. So in general, I just wanted to ask how efficient and how effective these pledges and these coalitions tend to have when it comes to post-COP implementation. Is it just like words being filled and just pledges being made during COPs and then they die after it, or some truth or some power is held after that? Yeah, these two are my questions.
I can answer on the multidimensional vulnerability index. Got it right that time. So I do think there is a general agreement, it seems, that another measurement is necessary. And so there's a lot of interest in the MBI, and the challenge then becomes what indicators are used for that. And I was frantically Googling while you were talking to see if I could find what those indicators are, because I don't have them now. And I couldn't actually find a great answer. So I'm not sure, maybe someone else knows the exact status of those conversations. But I know from my side, there has been a lot of discussion on the politics that goes behind choosing those indicators, because of course, certain indicators will benefit certain countries more than others. And so it's not simply a matter of saying, okay, we want a new system. The reason that we have this simplistic GDP per capita one is because it's simple and easy, and the data is there, relatively easy to measure. I think there is a need to move beyond that, and there is a need to provide something else. But yeah, the politics behind what those will be, I know, are challenging. And even within AOSIS as a group, there was a lot of debate on what that MBI should look like. As I said, these are very different countries that have different factors and certain characteristics, coastline or populations would impact some countries more than others. And I'm sure whatever index you end up using, you would have some level of unfairness on some countries and some than others.
Thank you for that, James. Did Leader Trumpa want to address the other question?
You'll have to remind me again what it was, because I was trying to type an answer to one of the questions in the chat box. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Nada, do you mind repeating what you had said?
Sure. So I was just talking about how at COPs there are a lot of pledges, and last COP there was this specific pledge when it comes to Coalition for High Ambition Multi-Level Partnerships. So I just wanted to see how you see these pledges as to be effective when it comes to true implementation of what's being pledged at COP beyond the confines of the 2 weeks that's happening at COP. Yeah, that's basically my question.
It depends on the nature of the partnership and the coalition. So I think what you saw last year was the first time ever the COP formally, as part of its agenda, had a local climate action summit that brought together governors, premiers, mayors, which has never been done before, right? So in a way, it's recognizing the role that those actors play, and that is meaningful. But again, without financing, what can that group of actors do that moves from ambition or commitment to implementation? And I think given the scale of the urgency that we have, it has to be about implementation. So I think that question of, financing still hasn't been unlocked, right? What you do have is less silos, more of these actors coming together, agreeing in principle to work together. But in order to then move that to implementation is the next challenge. So I think often what you'll find is a lot of announcements at COP, but how many of them are still alive as a network or a partnership a year later? And often that comes down to what is possible, what can be done within existing resources, or if we're really ambitious, how do we pool resources, or how do we get resources in order to actually implement some of the things that we want to do? So I think it's a mixed bag. On the subnational side, I think there's been a lot of space made, political space made for those governments. But at the same time, they're still not truly empowered to really implement until they can be properly financed.
That's great. Thank you so much, Trump, and thank you for those great questions, guys, that I'm thinking about a lot, and I'm sure everyone else is too. I put this in the chat, but Hina, Echo, and I know, Alan, you had something in the Q&A. If you guys will email me your questions, I will make sure that those get answered. I'm so sorry for running out of time. I know this always happens, but I guess it's a good thing because it means we've had a very fruitful discussion. Hopefully you guys feel that way as well. If you guys could just join me in giving a massive round of applause for our fantastic panelists. Thank you all so much for your time. That was very insightful. And I know I learned a lot, and I hope the rest of you guys are thinking about a lot as well. So just as a quick wrap up, I don't want to take too much more of your time, CFC members or panelists. But for CFC members, we are now in the solutions phase of the challenge. So you guys can basically start posting solutions anytime. I really hope that our panelists, their thoughts and insights have given you guys more things to think about with regards to policy solutions addressing the just green transition. The policy solutions phase, as you will have seen from the email, will remain open until Wednesday, April 24th at 12 p.m. So you do still have quite a bit of time. But it is a similar sort of challenge format to what we did in January. So basically, once you submit an idea, you'll be asked to refine it based on a few questions that we need to be thinking about when actually developing policy ideas. When it closes, also similar to January, we're going to hold a vote, and then the authors of the solutions that receive the most votes will actually get the chance to present them to policymakers on a live webinar in May. So also panelists, if you guys are interested in sort of seeing how this all shakes out over the next 6 weeks, we'd be more than happy to have you back for that event. One more event between this and our policymaker webinar in May. We have not set a date, so we're waiting still on a couple people's confirmation, but we will be having another brainstorming session. So for those of you who are new CFC members, this is basically a time for us to come together, work in small breakout groups, and actually start to workshop some policy ideas. I know for the AI challenge in the autumn, a couple of ideas did actually come out of that. So I would really encourage you to attend. It's a great way to sort of meet and interact with CFC members on a smaller scale. So I'm going to drop that registration link in the chat. So please go ahead and sign up for that. But yeah, I just want to close by saying thank you guys so much for your attendance, panelists. Thank you guys again so much for joining. And I hope everyone has a great night.